I guess wakes up from having passed out and then immediately attacks the Avengers. And when he does, he basically is really reciting this kind of this logic, basically telling them he was designed for the purpose of attacking them. But what's really interesting here is that Black Panther seems to pick up on something we didn't really notice before, in the sense that what the Vision is doing is basically acting like someone who's in a trance, in the sense that he's been more or less hypnotized, or he's been assigned a task, but he doesn't know why he's doing this. All he knows is that he's doing it because he was told to. And so the Vision seemingly seems to stop his attack on the Avengers, and he begins to basically talk with them and again try to figure out what's going on. And so what he does is he begins to probe his mind. He begins to look into why it is that this is happening. And what he realizes, or what he remembers, is that he was created by Ultron to destroy the Avengers. And so the Avengers, realizing of course the threat that Ultron faced, in the sense that they had previously faced Ultron one time before, of course his initial introduction into Marvel Comics, immediately go on the offensive. And of course the Vision says that he feels as though he's not supposed to be attacking them, and in some form or fashion they're supposed to be allies here. And so what the Vision does is he agrees to lead the Avengers to the headquarters, or I guess to the base of operations for Ultron. And what we do is we switch to Ultron here, and what we learn is that this was all part of Ultron's plan, that Ultron had initially created the Vision, and the Vision, again, as he had told us, was designed to kill the Avengers, but that should this have failed, that there was basically a subroutine, a backup program installed in the Vision, so that his programming would I guess allow him or require him to bring the Avengers to Ultron, so that Ultron could destroy the Avengers on his own. And so what happens is, of course, as the group enters Ultron's base, the Avengers are basically trapped. They're really kind of confined in this room with these ever-closing walls that would inevitably squish them and kill them off, and the Vision confronts Ultron. And what's really interesting here is that the Vision really conducts himself like a rebellious subordinate, like someone who is, I guess, who was created for a single purpose, but is rebelling against that purpose. And so he tells Ultron that ultimately he doesn't want to do this, that he doesn't want to fight the Avengers, he wants to join the Avengers, but more so than that, he wants to know what his purpose is. He wants to know why he's here, the reason why he was made. Of course, Ultron refuses to tell them this, and in response, of course, Ultron seemingly attacks the Vision, and the Vision seems to be able to thwart his attack, and Ultron seems destroyed in the process. And so what we do is we pick up with Avengers issue number 58, and in Avengers issue number 58, we get a little more to this story. We actually see more or less that we're picking up directly after Avengers issue number 57. And what happens here is the Avengers agree to induct the Vision into their ranks, but only once they actually find out what his purpose is, why it is that he was made, and even more than that, who he is. And so again, as they continue here, what happens is that Hank Pym recalls making some kind of an android, but he doesn't really remember what it was. And so what the group does is they travel back to the old suburban lab of Hank Pym. And again, what this does, this actually picks up with our our Ultron discussion, where we learn about why Ultron was made. We actually learn about the fact that Hank Pym was the one that made Ultron, which of course, you're welcome to check out our Ultron video if you want to get into that. But what Hank Pym also recalls is that at some point along the line, that the memories, or I guess the mind, the tapes of Wonder Man had been stored within the confines of this lab, and that they're now missing. And so what happens, of course, Hawkeye asks who Wonder Man was, and Iron Man begins to explain here. And what we find is that somewhere along the line, a man named Simon Williams had approached the Avengers and wanted to join their ranks. But the problem here is that he was suffering from an illness that was going to kill him. Of course, due to the fact that he had super strength, that he seemed to be a pretty solid guy, the Avengers inducted him into their ranks. But the problem is that Simon Williams was a double agent, but he didn't really seem to be a double agent, I guess, of his own accord. What had happened here was that he was basically being held against his own will by Baron Zemo, and Baron Zemo had basically been blackmailing him, telling him that he would not give him the cure to his disease unless he fought on his behalf. And so what Wonder Man did is he lured the Avengers into a trap, and in the process, Baron Zemo revealed that his intention was to kill the Avengers. And so because Wonder Man didn't want to partake in this, he actually freed Thor, but in the process, Baron Zemo escaped, and with him went the cure. And so Wonder Man had died in the arms of the Avengers. But what Hank Pym had done is he had scanned the mind of Wonder Man, and when he did, he had stored these scans in his lab. And so when Ultron had emerged, when Ultron had rebelled against Hank Pym when he was first created, and had wiped Hank Pym's mind of anything resembling memories about Ultron, that when Hank Pym left, Ultron began reassembling the lab. And what Ultron did is he took the memories, or took the mind patterns of Wonder Man, and he used them to create the Vision. And so what we find as issue number 58 begins to come to an end, is that we pick up with, again, the Avengers as they're talking about the Vision. And what they decide is that because the Vision had basically risked his life to save them, that their best bet here is to let the Vision become a member of the Avengers, because as far as they're concerned, he's done everything that he can to prove himself as a worthy member. And so what this does is is this basically marks the time in which the Vision will officially become a member of the Avengers, moving forward for quite some time in Marvel Comics. And so, following the appearance of the Vision in Marvel Comics, what we saw is that in 1968, Marvel had Avengers issues number 66 and 69 going. And what this was basically the Vision continuing to deal with the idea that he was more or less a copy of Wonder Man. And in fact, in issue number 66, what we find is that the Vision actually visits the grave of Wonder Man. Because again, this is very much an element that will stick with the Vision. For those of you guys who were fans of Star Trek, whether you were fans of the original Star Trek or the Next Generation, the Vision can best be compared to Spock or Data respectively, in the sense that he was a cyborg, or I guess a synthetic, that had elements of him that made him human, but he was always aspiring to become more human. He was always aspiring to, I guess, develop this identity of his own so that he could kind of break away from the shadow of Wonder Man, but it was something that he was never really able to do. And so what we found over the course of this series of issues number 66 through 69 is that Vision is ultimately taken over again by Ultron, and by virtue of this action, he's forced into making an adamantium body for Ultron. And so, of course, we see that Ultron is defeated at the hands of the Avengers, as we would expect. And so what we do is we move on to Avengers issue number 75. And with issues number 75 in 1970, what we find is that Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch return to the Avengers. And this is really an important element here, because what this is going to do is effectively set the stage for a lot of the events that come forward later on. With issue number 108 in 1973, the Scarlet Witch, I guess, and the Vision officially started dating one another. Now, it's very subtle in the way that this is done. This is really just an instance whereby the Vision is basically comforting the Scarlet Witch, where he tells her that if she needs to, she can basically cry on his shoulder. And of course, we see that Thor chimes in and simply tells the group to give these two some time, which we know that just by virtue of human interaction and the way things work, that ultimately this will lead into a relationship between the two of them. And in Avengers issue number 109, Marvel more or less cements this, but they really only cement it by the two of them holding hands. And the reason for this, the reason why Marvel doesn't overtly have the two of them showing any real manner of affection, is for a couple reasons. The first is because of the Comics Code Authority. Of course, the Comics Code Authority, established in 1954, was basically a set of guidelines whereby comic books had to basically print their material or write the material in such a way to where it was respectful of society at the time. And one of the conditions was that there couldn't be any overt sexual activity between two individuals. That is to say, at the time when this comic had come out in the 1970s, and especially, in the previous era in the 1960s, when comic books were very big during the Silver Age, individuals were able to show affection to one another, but they could only really do it by virtue of maybe holding hands or by virtue of saying they care about one another. They couldn't, I guess they couldn't involve themselves in overt sexual activities such as kissing. And so all they really had the two of them do was just hold hands. And so in 1975, with Giant Size Avengers issue number 4, the Scarlet Witch and the Vision officially marry one another. Now, in truth, as Roy Thomas had told us, this really just kind of was done in practicality. This really just kind of made sense here. And the reason why was because you had two individuals. You had the Vision, who was on a hunt for, to enhance his humanity, to become more human. But more so than that, he wanted to fit in. He wanted companionship. And then you had the Scarlet Witch, who had this very screwed up and isolated life, and who in a lot of ways wanted some measure of normalcy. And the two of them just kind of latched on to one another. They just kind of found themselves. Although I would go as far as to say this relationship was ultimately doomed to failure because it was one that was founded under the guise of two individuals dealing with the negative aspects of their lives as opposed to the positive aspects. And so what happens is that 7 years after this, in 1982, Marvel launches, a solo series called The Vision and Scarlet Witch. And the reason why they had done this was because there was some interest, a moderate amount of interest with regards to the Scarlet Witch and the Vision in terms of the relationship. But what we had found was that when Bill Mantlo and Rick Leonardi had put this comic together, this series together, there wasn't as much interest as Marvel thought. And so the series only ran for about 4 issues. But Marvel brought it back in volume 2 in 1985 with Steve Englehart and Richard Howell. And what they did is they introduced the concept of the Scarlet Witch having children, having 2 twin boys. Now, she was able to conceive by virtue of magic, but that was really the only information that we got. We didn't really know exactly how this had happened. The Scarlet Witch was simply just, just informed her husband that she was pregnant one day. And so what we saw was that in 1984, Marvel launched Avengers West Coast, or what would later become known as the West Coast Avengers, or at least that would kind of be given the name that a lot of fans would take on for the team. But what we saw was that Roger Stern had initially pushed this, and this was really just a way for Marvel to branch out into the realm of introducing more Avengers titles, to the possibility of having separate teams on different parts of the country. But what we saw was that in 1988, the Scarlet Witch and Vision had joined the team. And again, for the most part, they continued on about their normal roles, their normal acts as part of the West Coast Avengers. They were simply superheroes engaging in different activities. And so from here, what we do is we continue with Volume 1 of West Coast Avengers, and we see that in 1989, John Byrne runs a series called, I guess, The Vision Quest, which takes place in issues 42 through 45. And what had happened here is that John Byrne, who was now the writer and the penciler, I guess the artist for this particular story, didn't like the direction that Marvel had taken with the Vision and the Scarlet Witch. For him, it seemed very silly that we would have an android that would exist in the realm of the Vision, an android that was hunting for humanity. He also didn't like the idea that magic and different things like that had basically taken the place of actual contraception between the Scarlet Witch and the Vision. And so what he did here is he basically wiped the slate clean. He started all over again. And what happened is that over the course of this series, the Vision is basically disassembled. He's destroyed, and Hank McCoy is along with various other people. Hank Pym along with various other people try to reassemble him, but ultimately they just can't quite get the element that made him human. That is to say, they can't replicate the mind patterns of Simon Williams of Wonder Man. Now, the reason why they can't do it is for a couple reasons. One, because they can't actually find the patterns to do it. But two, while Simon Williams is alive during the West Coast Avengers, while he's been restored back to the Marvel landscape, he's unwilling to do this. And the reason why is because for Simon Williams, his brain patterns being copied were done against his will, and he felt like it was stripping him of what it was that made him who he was, that there was basically a copy of him running around out there. And so what John Byrne did is he gave us the Vision back, but the Vision had lost all the coloring to himself. He was actually just a pure white individual with a pure white cape. Not only that, he was devoid of all emotion. And so what this did was effectively create a rift between him and the Scarlet Witch. In addition, we learned that the Scarlet Witch's children weren't actually real. They weren't really children, and instead, they were the shards of Mephisto. And so everything that had really established this family element for the Scarlet Witch and the Vision was totally eliminated. It was gone completely. And so while this rift formed, ultimately the two of them split apart. And so what we find is that over the course of the remaining comics, the comics leading up to Avengers Volume 3, issue number 12 in 1999, the two of them basically operate on two different levels. The Vision continues to try to regain his humanity. He tries to regain what it is that made him unique, that made him an individual that could really be something more than just an android. The Scarlet Witch, of course, continues her actions and goes about her life, which again, we cover a lot of this during our video on the Scarlet Witch. But ultimately what happens is that these circumstances lead up to the Avengers Disassembled event. And of course, as we had talked about in Avengers Disassembled with our videos, the Vision had appeared, and the Vision had began coughing up various, spheres, and in turn, these spheres turned into versions of Ultron that started attacking Avengers Mansion. But what Marvel doesn't tell us here, and something they've never explained to this day, is why it is this had happened. If this had happened because the Scarlet Witch made the Vision do it, or if this had happened because this was some kind of subroutine programmed into the Vision by Ultron, if the Avengers had ever sent out a white call distress signal. Marvel's never given us an answer to that question, and at this point, given the fact that the story's so old, I doubt they ever will. Now from here, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end, and the reason why is because this is going to lead into the Marvel Now event. And of course, with Marvel Now, Marvel had basically rebooted the character of the Vision. They had actually given him a new identity and made him a new person entirely. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.
This is you. This is you in 40 years. Looks just like you.
Be sure to follow me on Twitter. There you can keep up with all the updates from Comics Explained and talk to me directly. So, as we get into our discussion about Thor, there's a couple things we need to go over first. The first thing is that Thor's history is as convoluted as it is lengthy. It is ridiculously in depth. And so, in truth, if we were going to do a full in depth explanation video on Thor, it would take us an hour. And I'm not going to make an hour long video. So what we're going to do here is there are a couple of things that we're going to highlight, a couple of things that we're going to go over here. Of course, one of the most notable is going to be Beta Ray Bill, but the other thing is going to be Ragnarok. And the reason why is because Ragnarok is a very, very important element in Thor's continuity, and Ragnarok actually leads directly into Thor returning to the Marvel landscape after the events of Civil War, which of course, again, is something that we'll discuss here. But with Thor's initial introduction into Marvel Comics, he actually appears in Journey into Mystery, issue number 83. Now, with Thor's initial introduction, this is where things get very confusing for a lot of people. When we're first introduced to Thor, we're introduced to a man named Donald Blake. And Donald Blake, as he's shown to us, is a man who is apparently vacationing in Europe, but also has a bad leg and is holding a cane. Now, what happens is that as he's beginning to leave this particular area, that aliens land behind him. Now, he's initially not aware of it, but it eventually comes to a point where he becomes aware of their presence. And when he does, he immediately tries to run away. Now, as he's making his way to a particular cave that has caught his eye, he actually loses his cane in the process. And so at this point, he really doesn't have a way to move very fast. He doesn't have a way to really get to where he needs to go very fast. And so as a result, he's kind of resigned himself to his fate. And so as he's sitting in this cave, he's leaning against a rock. And when it does, the rock seems to maybe turn around or seems to swivel in some capacity and reveal a hidden cavern. But once he gets inside this cavern, he sees what appears to be a very old cane sitting on a table of some kind. And as a result, he really feels as though this is maybe the fates playing a joke on him. He feels as though perhaps he's a person who's basically just going to die in this cavern. And so what he does is he grabs the cane and he smacks it against the wall in frustration. And when he does, the cane turns into the hammer of Thor and he turns into Thor. And so he looks at the cane, he looks at the hammer and he sees it on the hammer is an inscription. And of course, this is an inscription that's well known in the realm of pop culture media in general. Of course, the inscription reading, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." And so what he realizes here is that he is now Thor. And so he begins to give us this explanation on what it is that he knows in the realm of Thor, what he recalls about the character of Thor. And what he says is that as far as he can remember, that Thor had a wide array of different abilities at his disposal. But one of the first things he learns is that if he puts the hammer down, that is to say, if he stops touching the hammer for any more than what appears to be 60 seconds, then he'll revert back to his Donald Blake form. Now, in the original introduction of Thor, that is to say, in this comic, Marvel doesn't actually give us a time frame. All we see is that he puts the hammer down, he lets go of it, and it seems to be for some amount of time, and then he reverts back to his normal form, realizing that he has to hold the hammer in order to maintain the form of Thor. It actually won't be until later on in Marvel Comics that Marvel will establish a 60-second window that as long as he is holding the hammer, as long as he grabs it within 60 seconds after letting it go, that he'll maintain his form of Thor. And this is the reason why whenever you look at the character of Thor, he's somehow got the hammer on his back, or he's got it on his hip, or in some way the hammer is physically touching his body. It's basically a way for Marvel to kind of build this element into it. And so what happens here is that, again, as he goes over the information that he recalls about Thor, he tells us that Thor seems to be the only person who can lift his hammer, or lift the hammer of Mjolnir, due to the fact that the hammer is so heavy. Now, again, this is a very early thing. Marvel will come back later on and say that it's not simply the weight of the hammer that keeps people from being able to wield it. It's also the worthiness of that person, again, tying into the inscription. And so what we'll find later on as we get into characters like Beta Ray Bill is that there are a handful of characters who can wield Thor's hammer, but the characters are only in a handful of people. It's really not that many folks. And so what happens is he begins experimenting again with this hammer, and he says that if he throws the hammer, that the hammer will return to him. It will come back, which of course he does. He also says that if he hits the ground twice with the hammer, that it allows him to manipulate weather. Now, this does not give him, the same kind of finite control that Storm has, but it gives him the ability to create rainstorms, to create thunderstorms, and so on and so forth, that would ultimately result in massive tornadoes, the ability to control lightning and different things like that. And then if he hits it on the ground 3 times, that it would bring the storm to an end. And so one of the final things that he realizes again that if he taps the hammer on the ground once, that it'll turn him back into Donald Blake, which is going to be a reoccurring theme along his character when he's going about guess, going about his existence as a superhero. But again, what happens here is that over the course of the remainder of this comic, he uses his newfound powers to defeat the aliens, and then goes back to Empire State University as a surgeon or as a doctor performing his work, and then being a superhero in his off time. Now, while all these original comics were being introduced, while all these original characters were coming into the Thor comics, we saw some of the mainstays appearing at the same time. In issue number 84, we saw Jane Foster appear in the Thor continuity. And Jane Foster, as she was initially introduced to us, was a woman that Thor was very much in love with, but who he didn't believe actually returned her affections. But in truth, Marvel tells us that it is that way, that she's simply just waiting for him to say something. Now, initially, it's very hesitant for Donald Blake to actually get out there and to really, I guess, make his feelings known to her, perhaps for fear of rejection. We don't know what the exact reason is here, but as far as he explains it, I guess maybe giving us some insight here is that he feels as though maybe there's some element of her that really wouldn't want to be associated with a guy who has any kind of a limp or a physical weakness. But again, this may just be one part of the equation as to why he doesn't make his advances known to her. But what we also see is that in issue number 85, Loki appears. Now, Loki's appearance in the Thor continuity is a major thing, and the reason why is because Loki will be one of the most enduring foes in the entire Thor continuity. He will always come back. Now, sometimes he'll fight on behalf of Thor if the situation is grave enough, but 9 times out of 10, he's usually always causing some kind of trouble. Now, what's really interesting here about Loki's introduction into the Marvel continuity is that the way that he's brought in really ties into the kind of thing that you would expect to see in Norse mythology, and that's what Jack Kirby and Stan Lee did when they introduced Thor. They would constantly get into this Norse mythology. They would constantly bring in elements that would seem like something you would see in Norse mythology. And with Loki, he had previously been confined to a tree for causing trouble. He had actually been, I guess, isolated inside of this tree. And the only way for him to escape was if somebody in Asgard had basically shed a tear for his plight. But because he was basically the most hated person there, that wasn't going to happen. But over the years, what he had done was learn to manipulate the tree. And so when Heimdall came by, who of course was the guardian of the Bifrost, which allowed the Asgardians to travel from one realm to another, he had basically caused I guess a leaf to slip or to fall away from a tree branch, and it landed in the eye of Heimdall, which caused Heimdall to shed a tear. And as a result, Loki was able to leave. Now, the way that he did this was really kind of interesting. He basically bypassed the imprisonment by saying that his plight was being stuck in a tree. Because he was able to manipulate the tree that he was stuck in, he was able to get out. But again, these are very early comics for Marvel with regards to Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and so a lot of these things don't necessarily make sense now, but they made a lot of sense back then. And so what we do as we continue with this is we see that in Journey into Mystery, issue number 97, that the Tales of Asgard appear. Now, the Tales of Asgard were a series of stories that had been introduced in the stories of Thor that would basically fill in the gaps. They would tell us a lot of the things that went on in the past of Asgard that led things to where they are now. For example, some of the stories involving the conflicts that Thor himself was involved in alongside Loki as a child, some of the conflicts that Odin had been involved in that had led to the modern day formation of Asgard and different things like that. Now, one of the other things that we had seen was that Marvel had taken the Journey into Mystery stories and they had basically converted the entire comic to a Thor story. And so what we saw was that by issue number 104 of Journey into Mystery, the name had been changed to Journey into Mystery with the Mighty Thor. And it was basically just Marvel converting, slowly altering the entire Journey into Mystery publication into Thor's solo comic. And the reason why is because Thor's stories had really began to overshadow anything else that was appearing in Journey into Mystery. It was really at a point now where the Journey into Mystery stories revolved around Thor. And so it was the easiest way for Marvel to begin transitioning things. And this continued along this entire concept. This continued along this path. Again, we saw with this shared continuity that we saw various characters like Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, for example, appearing in issue number 109 of Journey into Mystery. We saw that with Journey into Mystery, issue number 108, that Doctor Strange had appeared. And so again, this was just a way for Marvel to continue this trend. It was a way for Marvel to, I guess, bring things in. But one of the other things that we saw, and this was really an important point in the history of Thor's comics, was that in issue number 112 of Journey into Mystery, that we ultimately saw the Avengers begin to take form. Now, what had happened here is that the Incredible Hulk had basically been goaded into attacking, or I guess going on a rampage. And so we saw Thor alongside Namor the Submariner and the original Avengers come together to try to hold the Incredible Hulk off. And so this was an instance whereby Thor had hypothesized the idea that the Avengers should form, the Avengers should take place. They should be a team that operates under the guise of protecting the world from dangerous threats threats when nobody else can. And so again, as we continue to move forward with this, we ultimately see that with issue number 113, that Thor reveals his identity to Jane Foster. And this was a really big moment here, because keeping in mind, this entire time up to this point, Thor's been operating with dual identities. He's been Donald Blake whenever it was that he didn't need to be Thor, and he was Thor whenever it was that he had to get involved in some kind of a conflict here. But he had always had an interest in Jane Foster. He had always really enjoyed the company of Jane Foster. And while the two of them had previously sort of gotten together, she didn't know that he was Thor. She didn't know that he was two people. Now, what we also see is that by March of 1966, that Marvel basically converts the entire Journey into Mystery series over into Thor's solo series. That is to say, they get rid of the Journey into Mystery name and they simply call it The Mighty Thor. What they also do here is they get rid of Tales of Asgard. And this is where we started seeing publications like the Inhumans coming into play in Marvel Comics. This is when we started seeing them, I guess, appearing in Thor stories, which would again go on to spur the Inhumans into popularity here. What we also see is that in issue number 159 that we actually get the full original background of Thor. And this is something that took quite a long time for Jack Kirby and Stan Lee to come up with, something for them to introduce to us. And what we learn with this actual backstory here is that Donald Blake is really looking to find out what's going on. And he's really looking to find out how it is that Thor had ended up in a position to where he is now. And so what he does is he begins speaking, I guess, with Odin, using, I guess, an attempt to communicate with him using his mind. But it's more or less like a shared dream state, I guess, might be the best way to explain it here. But what Odin basically tells Donald Blake is that Thor had previously he had courage. He had everything that was befitting of a prince of Asgard, but he wasn't humble. He didn't have humility. And so what he had done is he had cast Thor to the planet Earth and then put him in the body of a man named Donald Blake, or I guess assigned him to that kind of a role, which in turn also gave him a limp. Now, Odin says that he had also put the hammer under the disguise of being a cane in the cave where Donald Blake had initially found it, hoping that Donald Blake would find it one day. But the entire purpose here was to force Thor to live among the humans, or live among humanity, I guess mortals as they would call us, in an effort to basically teach him how to be humble, to teach him humility, so that he could truly understand what it meant to govern over those who are weaker than he is, but do it in a way to where it benefits all. And so eventually, as we continue on, we see that Jack Kirby actually leaves the Thor series with issue number 179, and that Neil Adams, one of Marvel's, I guess, premier artists at the time, had taken over to draw a couple comics with issues number 180 and issues number 181. But what we also saw was that by issue number 279 that Stan Lee had left the series, and so with issue number 280 that Roy Thomas had come into play. Now, Roy Thomas wrote some pretty interesting stories, but Roy Thomas would not nearly be as important of a writer for Thor's continuity as Walt Simonson. When Walt Simonson was introduced in 1983 with volume 1, issue number 337, Walt Simonson had done a lot of stories that had really revolved around the element of Thor, had really focused on Thor, that is to say, the mythology. For example, we saw that with issue number 344 that Malekith had first appeared in the Marvel continuity, and again, this was one of the characters who would go on to continue to be a major foe in the realm of Thor's continuity. We had seen that in issue number 367, issue number 337, that Beta Ray Bill had appeared in Marvel's continuity. Now, Beta Ray Bill appearing as far as the Thor mythology is a very important thing, and the reason why is because prior to Beta Ray Bill, there had never been anyone who had been able to wield Thor's hammer. It had never been seen before. It seemed as though Thor was the only person who could actually wield his own hammer, and that anybody else who tried simply just wouldn't be able to pick it up. But what we had seen is that Marvel had basically made it okay for people to wield Thor's hammer, and fans weren't very upset with this. In fact, fans really enjoyed the concept of Beta Ray Bill. This is considered to be one of the greatest moments in the run of Walt Simonson when it came to the character of Thor. And so what we saw was that Marvel had to be very tentative in the future when it came to the idea of people who were wielding Thor's hammer. We saw that in the Marvel and DC crossover, for example, that Superman was able to wield the hammer. We saw that Captain America was able to wield the hammer. We saw that only the most, prized people in comic book continuity were able to wield Thor's hammer, but nobody else was able to do that. And so again, as we continue with this video, what we do is we pick up with the story of Ragnarok. Now, Ragnarok is a story that a lot of people are really, really intrigued about due to the idea of the Thor Ragnarok film coming out. And we can do, a separate video that really gets us a little more in-depth, where we can talk about the events of Thor Ragnarok. But what had basically happened here was that this was the equivalent of the end of times for the Asgardian universe. This was basically a circumstance where we learned that there were beings who existed called the Ones Who Sit in Shadow, I believe, and these were beings who basically had either perpetuated or possibly even created the cycle of the Asgardian universe being destroyed and then being reborn. And what they would do is they would feed on this cycle. It would be their sustenance. It would be a way for them to keep themselves going. And so what had basically been happening for an unknown amount of time, for countless eons, is that the Thor universe, or the Asgardian universe, would come to an end, and then it would be reborn. And so Odin would come back, Thor would come back, Loki would come back, they would live their lives, and then everything would come to an end and it would start all over again. Now again, we don't know exactly how long this had gone on for, but the entire basis behind the Ragnarok concept was that as a result, Thor at the end of the story had basically sacrificed his life to destroy the Ones Who Sit in Shadow. And so as a result, once we got around to the Civil War conflict, Thor was presumed to have been dead. He simply existed inside of a void. He really just wasn't alive here. And so what we do is we pick up with Volume 3. And Volume 3 picks up after the events of Civil War, of the main Civil War conflict. This, I think, actually picks up during the post-Civil War Initiative event, which again was a 30-something series of comics I think that Marvel had published with the intention of picking up after the events of Civil War. But what had happened here is Thor had basically arrived back to the Marvel landscape, and he had found that, of course, Ragnarok, or I guess the character who would be called Ragnarok, had been made. The cyborg version of Thor, which was made by Reed Richards and Hank Pym and Tony Stark. And of course, he was awfully angry about this, but at the same time, what we had also found was that his desire was to bring Asgard back, because again, after the events of Thor Ragnarok, everybody had died. Everybody in Asgard had been killed off. There were no more Asgardians. And so as a result, Thor had actually formed Asgard in the middle of Oklahoma and then went about the process of waking people up. And what we had learned over the course of Volume 3 is that the Asgardians were in some capacity still alive, but the minds of men and women were basically portals that would allow them to come back, in the sense that that Heimdall, for example, was, I guess, occupying the body of a man who was very rebellious against anybody who entered his town post-Civil War. He was very strong about protecting that town. And so what Thor had done was basically awaken this man and bring Heimdall out of him, and then restore Heimdall back to the Earth 616 continuity. But nonetheless, as things progressed with Thor, we ultimately saw that while Thor post Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and even post Walt Simonson, it had some ups and downs. While it had some interesting concepts to it, that overall Thor's continuity sort of began to drop off. It sort of began to slump as the years went by, which ultimately leads up to the current day in 2014, when we find that Marvel has basically eliminated Thor Odinson as being the actual Thor and replaced him with a woman whose identity we yet don't know. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace. There you can keep up with all the updates from Comics Explained and talk to me directly. So as we get into our discussion about Batman Zero Year, what we're going to find here is that while Batman didn't necessarily get a full continuity reboot, that is to say, he didn't see the same kind of reboot as characters like Superman or The Flash, what we're going to find is that for those of you guys who were interested in jumping into the Batman series, that Batman Zero Year is going to be a great place to start, because in truth, the story of Batman and his parents is really an ageless tale. And so what we're going to do as we progress through this story is that we're ultimately going to pick up with Batman already being an adult and arriving back in Gotham and ultimately undertaking the mantle of Batman. And so what we do is we start here with Secret City, is that we find that we're basically picking up with the Red Hood gang. And again, this is a really cool tie-in with Scott Snyder here in terms of what he's using for the Red Hood gang. And the reason why is because, as we'll see as the story progresses, Scott Snyder is basically using a combination of the original 1951 Red Hood, but he's also using, using this in conjunction with the Alan Moore Red Hood. And the reason why I say that is because what we find is that the Red Hood gang is, of course, involved in some kind of a robbery, but the Red Hood gang does not identify themselves by name. They simply identify themselves by numbers. The leader, of course, being Red Hood 1, and the others are referred to numerically, most presumably based on their rankings. That is to say, where they stand in relation to the respect among the other gang members and Red Hood 1. So Red Hood 2 would most likely be the second highest person up, and so on and so forth. But again, what happens here is that as this bank is being robbed, the bank manager seems to stand up to this gang member. He seems to stand up to Red Hood 1 and simply tell Red Hood 1 that he really can't do this, that he really can't get himself involved in this capacity. And so what we find is that Red Hood 1 instructs Red Hood 5 to kill this bank manager. And so Red Hood 5 simply knocks the bank manager unconscious. Now, initially, this is I wouldn't go as far as to say a shock to Red Hood 1, but what it does is it puts him on alert. And the reason why is because, as Red Hood 1 describes to us, Red Hood 5 murders people without any real regard. And so the fact that he would actually knock this bank manager unconscious as opposed to just killing him is, again, really sort of a, an alert to him, really something to indicate that things aren't what they're supposed to be. And so what we find here is that as they're basically interrogating him, as Red Hood 1 is beginning to put the pieces together, he realizes, again, this is not Red Hood 5. And so what's revealed to us is that as Red Hood 5 begins to battle the other members of the Red Hood gang, that we learn this is actually Bruce Wayne. And again, this is basically a reintroduction. This is Bruce Wayne picking up with becoming, and returning to Gotham as a vigilante. And so once Bruce Wayne is able to attack, or at the very least thwart, the Red Hood gang, he's ultimately able to escape into the sewers and escape back home. Now, the difference here with the way this story goes is that Bruce Wayne didn't simply just arrive at Wayne Manor one day and then immediately undertake the mantle of Batman and start attacking people. Instead, Bruce Wayne's actually living in the, the most crime-ridden part of Gotham. And this is kind of interesting for a couple reasons. The first is because I would go as far as to say that it gives Bruce Wayne a really good understanding of what crime is like, of what it's like to live in that part of the city. But what it also does is it basically puts him in the lion's den. He knows exactly where to go and who it is that he needs to get to. But what's happening here is there's also a mishmash of other things taking place in Bruce Wayne's life. One of the most notable things is that Alfred Pennyworth is really debating with Bruce Wayne. For one, Alfred Pennyworth doesn't like the idea of living in this brownstone, or this sort of red and brickish kind of apartment, which is what they're actually called, brownstone apartments. But he doesn't like living in the heart of Gotham around these crime-ridden areas. But more so than that, what he really wants to see Bruce Wayne do is step into the role that had been left vacant by Thomas Wayne. But Bruce Wayne is really, doesn't want to get involved in this. He really doesn't want to join this concept. And this, again, gives us some very valuable insight into the mindset of Bruce Wayne, because what it tells us here is that Bruce Wayne doesn't care about the material things. He doesn't really care about being, a major part of Gotham, which is ironic, because as we'll find in later comics, especially when we get into the Court of Owls and the Night of Owls, Bruce Wayne is most effective in being able to change Gotham when he's fighting the war on two fronts. One, when he's able to contribute financially to the city of Gotham to revamp the areas that need to be revamped, but also when he's carrying out his vigilante role as Batman. But again, as the two of them begin to talk and as the two of them begin to continue, this is when we really see Scott Snyder drawing on the various incarnations of the Red Hood, when he tells us that the way the Red Hood is able to bolster their ranks is through a combination of blackmail and threatening. Now again, this really seems to draw more elements from Alan Moore's Red Hood than it does the original 1951 Red Hood. And the reason I say that is because during the Killing Joke, when Alan Moore was effectively giving us the origins of the Joker, the way he had done it was basically telling us that Joker, the person who would become the Joker, was shanghaied into it. That criminals were going around with a red hood and they were, approaching people who had some kind of inside knowledge about the place the criminals intended to rob. And what they would tell these people is that they were going to be the inside man, that the hood was going to be a way to protect their identities. But in reality, the hood was designed to basically depict them as the leader of the Red Hood gang. And so if for some reason they were caught by the police or they were seen by the police, the criminals could point to the Red Hood and say that he's the leader, he's the one that orchestrated the whole thing, and they could simply escape, leaving the person who was basically tricked into the situation to be left at the behest of the authorities. And so again, what happens here is we learn a lot more about this entire concept. We learn a lot more about what's going on with Bruce Wayne. Again, tying to this idea that he has a mishmash of things going on, one of the things that happens here is that he meets Jim Gordon for the first time as he's operating under this vigilante attitude. And of course, Jim Gordon makes his stance known, and the stance of the Gotham Police Department, in no uncertain terms when he says that, of course, they know about this vigilante who's going around and trying to stop criminals, but that ultimately the role of stopping criminals in the city of Gotham lies with the police. And the problem here is that if one man is able to do what he wants in order to try to curb crime, then because it makes him a vigilante, other people may take up the cause, and it would lead to a state of lawlessness. And in truth, this is a very reasonable argument here. This is a very valuable argument, because if everybody were to carry out their own manner of justice, then there would be no true justice. Justice would be left to the perspective of the person who is carrying it out. And so while one man would say that a person who steals from him should maybe be imposed with some kind of jail time, another person may say that if a person steals from him, they should die. And so there's no real standard for justice within the city. And so this is one of the reasons why Jim Gordon